Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Burington. Welcome to Smarty Plants, a Minnesota Department of Agriculture podcast teaching you about invasive species that affect our environment and agricultural resources. The environment is experiencing rapid change, whether it be from invasive species or weather events. Many of us are taking notice of how the environment is changing, and it is making us a bit uneasy. You may not know it, but that uneasy feeling actually has a name: eco-anxiety. Angie Gupta from the University of Minnesota Extension Office is here with us today to dive into the topic of eco-anxiety. Angie Gupta is a University of Minnesota Extension professor of forestry who specializes in terrestrial invasive species. She's done invasive species early detection education and outreach, including participatory science, from crowdsourcing to community science since about 2008. Angie's been a key leader of the University of Minnesota Extension's Invasive Species Community of Practice since its inception in 2016, and is a key leader in the effort to improve invasive species common names. Angie co-created the Empower You course to engage decision makers about invasive species. Angie earned an MA in Organizational Management from Spring Arbor University and a BS in Forestry from the University of Kentucky. Prior to joining Extension, Angie was an industrial forester working with private landowners in Michigan and a U.S. Peace Corps agroforestry extensionist in Kenya, East Africa. Angie also works on climate-ready woodlands that inspired and now incorporates eco-anxiety education and management. Angie's been with the University of Minnesota Extension in Rochester for 21 years. Thanks for joining me, Angie.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, to talk a little bit about eco-anxiety, we know many of us are experiencing some concern about changes to our environment and climate, especially with like emerald ash borer and jumping worms. But can you tell us more about eco-anxiety and what exactly that term means?
Yeah, so eco-anxiety is a really big deal for a lot of people. About 68% of U.S. adults experience at least a little bit of eco-anxiety. So if you're struggling with these emotions, please know you're not alone. But you asked, what is eco-anxiety? So eco-anxiety is extreme worry about the environment or climate because of human-caused current or future harm. So it's these feelings that come as we experience or worry about our changing environment. And that can be from many different types of reasons.
Perfect. And so what are some things that may be causing eco-anxiety? I already kind of gave a little hint as to two of them already with emerald ash borer and jumping worms, but what are some other ones, and can you kind of describe them?
Yeah, of course. So I came to eco-anxiety not as any realization that these were the feelings that I was having, but rather I was leading a participatory science project related to jumping worms, so an invasive worm relatively new to Minnesota. And my volunteers were very regularly closing their emails with the phrase, "I'm devastated." And then people were calling me on the phone and they would cry about their invasive jumping worms and about not knowing what to do. And as an extension forester, I did not know what to do with those emotions. It wasn't baffling why they were having them, but I just did not know what to do with them. And it became very clear that if I wanted to work with these volunteers and really service my participants well, I needed to understand those emotions better. So the first year of that project, which ultimately ended up into 3 years of trying to better understand how we can mitigate the impact of jumping worms on home landscapes, it was the first year of the pandemic, so it was 2020. So the world was already a pretty scary and stressful place. And this was just like one more thing. So the Minnesota Master Naturalist Program ended up having to switch to do everything online. And they put an all call out to educators with an extension asking if we had capstone class things that people could do to finish off their educational course. And so I pitched the idea of having volunteers help me do a literature review about the emotional impacts of jumping worms. And God bless the Master Naturalist. A group of them picked that as their capstone project. And so I was able to work with them, and they were able to do some literature review work. And we looked for the emotional impacts of invasive species, and there was nothing. Well, first we looked for the emotional impacts of jumping worms, nothing. Then we looked for the emotional impacts of invasive species, nothing. And it wasn't until we upscaled it even further that we stumbled in to this field of eco-anxiety. And so once we did that, it really opened our eyes to this whole field of literature. And we realized that indeed that's what these participants were experiencing. So a lot of people, I think, have anxiety about our changing climate, and that is very real as well. But that is not actually what brought me to this work. It was invasive species. And so I think that's just an interesting reminder that this anxiety about our changing environment can come from many different places.
So in talking about a little bit more about eco-anxiety and some of the feelings, like what are some of those common feelings that might be coming up for people who are experiencing this, like eco-anxiety? Like, can you describe them?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And so the literature is pretty clear that eco-anxiety can evoke many different types of feelings. And I think it's important to recognize that and not pigeonhole yourself into one of them. But they are fear, worry, grief, guilt, anger, enthusiasm, stress, and being overwhelmed. And so then those can kind of manifest into feelings of confusion, shock, trauma, solastalgia, which I'll define in a moment, shame, helplessness, but also expectation and excitement. So again, really, sometimes it can feel awkward to be excited about something when you know that it might also be coupled with grief or worry. But that is the state of eco-anxiety. You can have all of these feelings and they can be muddled and mixed together, and that is normal. And then I said solastalgia, so I want to kind of define that. So that is the feelings evoked by a changed landscape. So common examples that I usually reference are if you grew up on a farm and you go back and visit and it's been turned into a parking lot, you're likely to experience this remorse for a place that no longer exists. In invasive species work, I think I see professionals experience this when maybe they had a beloved park, maybe they're even responsible for, and then emerald ash borer comes through and kills all of the ash trees, and they have to take them down and remove them, and they go back to that same place, and it just doesn't have the same feelings, and they have this sense of remorse about this change, and that's solastalgia.
Yeah, there's a lot of ash that were planted after Dutch elm disease, and that all have been infested by emerald ash borer, and you have these very large ash trees, and removing them, it completely changes how that park will feel. I've seen that with parks near my house in the Southeast Metro, and yeah, it's just a huge difference. Like you have these large mature trees and lots of shade, and then now you're starting these brand new young trees, but eventually they'll get there. So there is hope at the end with that one.
Yeah, and that one, and whether it's from emerald ash borer or a huge storm, a tornado, or Del Rancho, something like that, I do think it's really important. One of the things I hope everyone takes away from this podcast is to lean into those areas of hope and agency, that there is hope for a future and that you have the power to make it better. And I think the tree planting, like if you can envision that what will come after the ash has died, and if you are a person that can help inform the species that you get to plant and be a part of the planting, that can really, you can create ritual around that to mourn the loss of the tree that's gone, yet still look for that hopeful future. And if you're a homeowner and you get to pick the species, I mean, there's a lot of power in that. So it's one of those things where absolutely sit with the mourning of those trees and then realize the opportunity that's presented by all that sunlight hitting the ground.
Nice. So what kind of data is available on the number of people that are experiencing eco-anxiety? You kind of gave a little bit of some numbers in the beginning here, so can you expand on that?
I can. And just in case people want to look up any of this stuff, I want to just make sure that I give a shout out to the University of Minnesota Extension website about eco-anxiety, because the statistics and the helpful hints and the emotions are all there. So z.umn.edu/EX as an extension, and then ECO, ECO/anxiety, ANXIETY. You could probably just Google University of Minnesota Extension eco-anxiety too. But you asked about the numbers. So as I said before, and I think it's important to repeat, this number, 68% of U.S. adults have experienced at least a little eco-anxiety. That's actually from 2019. I strongly suspect more people have experienced it since then.
Yeah.
So you're not alone. And that can be really helpful to remember. One of the things that came out of that jumping worm research was that people felt really like the outlier, the one person that was worried about this species. They really felt like the crazy person in the room. And just know that isn't the truth. Like, most of us are experiencing eco-anxiety. Some other numbers. So in a poll from 2020 through the American Psychological Association, 72% of poll participants are very or somewhat motivated to make change. So I think that's important to remember. One of the things that I like to remind people is anxiety is only a problem if your concern about it is greater than the impact. But anxiety is a really great human emotion to prepare you for the future, right? So if I am going to be interviewed on a podcast and I'm nervous or anxious about that, and as a result, that forces me to prepare in advance and have the statistics ready and in front of me, then I'm likely to be a better interviewee. We're likely to have a better outcome as a result of my anxiety about that. It's the same with eco-anxiety. So if I'm anxious and nervous about the future and that causes me to make meaningful change, then I'm deploying that anxiety well. And so the statistic I just read was 72% of poll participants are very or somewhat motivated to make change. So they're leaning into that anxiety to make meaningful change for a better future outcome for the environment. So that's one. Another one is 47% of the 18 to 34-year-olds say that climate stress affects their daily lives. So almost half of our young adults have their life is negatively impacted by this stress. I think that's important to remember. And then 60% of adults say that they have changed their behavior to reduce their contributions to climate change. So 72% of poll responses were motivated to make change, and 60% actually reported making change. And so I think there's hope in both of those numbers.
Yeah, those are great numbers, especially for the actually doing the change too afterwards too. The just 60% of the 72 are actually doing it. So yeah, I mean, it's and part of preparing for it is that seeing something I know in my yard and stuff, learning more about jumping worms because I had noticed some of the soil, and I said, well, I know there's more people that have this, and I know there's information out there. So then you go on deep dive into everything that you can find about jumping worms, and then learn about it, and then try. There's no way I can get rid of every single one, but I can try to make the best decisions that I can. And I know that's my part that I'm playing in helping the situation and dealing with the anxiety that I have about it too. So
you brought up the emotional impact of jumping worms. And I just want to say one of the outcomes of that work that the Master Naturalist volunteers did when we stumbled upon eco-anxiety and we started to incorporate it in our programs is that there's actually a 2-page resource that you can get online, University of Minnesota Extension Jumping Worms, that is very much targeted to people who have jumping worms, and it's the how to manage the emotional toll of jumping worms. And I share that example because that's the single piece that people take the extra couple of steps to email me their gratitude about. So they might find all kinds of interesting and useful information in our resource page about jumping worms, but that emotional toll piece is the one that people will actually take the additional steps and email me about because it's the thing that has brought them the most, I think, comfort. The others are tactical approaches to management, but they're not really addressing their human experience, and that does address their human experience. And it's been really comforting to see how much that has mattered.
Yeah, it definitely has for a lot of people. So what are some of the environmental factors that are common triggers for eco-anxiety in people? We've already mentioned EAB and jumping worms, specifically kind of invasive species, but can you give some more examples?
I sure can. So Friday, it was 72 degrees. So that was Friday, November 14th in Rochester, Minnesota, and it was 72 degrees. I will say I had a birthday the day before. I had taken Friday off. It was a beautiful day to be outside working on my new bike. But it also, my enthusiasm for this wonderful warm weather day was tampered by the fact that it was mid-November, and it shouldn't have been like that. And so that really big swings in our temperature, I think, evoke a lot of anxiety. And I will share that I really struggle to both lean into the beauty of the day while also recognizing my feelings of anxiety about that day. And I think it's just that tension that we're going to have to sort out how to live through. Another example of this, which I do think that one thing I like to remind people is we become more resilient with experience. So another day, like last Friday, that was super abnormally warm was back February 22nd, 2024 in Rochester. So February 22nd, we had no snow and it was 54 degrees outside. I was like freaking out, right? From my work perspective, I was like, oh my gosh, I do a ton of phonology work. I have people look for things at very specific times. What on earth is going to happen if everything pops 3 or 4 weeks or a month early? I mean, I can't even get my brain around that. And then I chose to have lunch outside with my colleagues. Again, totally freaky in February. And so I struggled with those emotions. I'm not saying this is good, but then January 30th of this past year, 2025, we hit that same temperature of 54 degrees. And so 3 weeks earlier than the craziness that had been 2024. And emotionally, I was better prepared to deal with it. Like, I've come to realize that I mourn the absence of snow and really cold temperatures, and I hope that we see more of them. I love to cross-country ski. I love to snowshoe. But what occurred to me between 24 and 25 was I love to hike. And so the hiking season got a lot longer. And so I could really comfortably work on my bike last Friday when it was brand new and it was exciting. I didn't have to wear gloves. And it was really enjoyable, even though I also had to work through some of these eco-anxiety. So one of the things that I find most challenging is how to truly love the many more lovely days we're getting. Because the weird outcome of climate change for Minnesota is it's likely to make us more livable and, frankly, to have more beautiful days.
Yep.
But I kind of miss the reading because the weather's really bad outside and snuggling on my couch with the cat.
Yep. And I've had that with the kids, too, that I have some young kids, and they've been out biking. And I was like, we don't usually continue to, bike just randomly after school, the bus drops them off and stuff, and they're just still outside playing in the beautiful days, like sweatshirts and maybe some hats and gloves. But yeah, just it's extended that time a lot longer now. But then I also think, well, is it going to be an extra snowy or extra cold winter to kind of offset it? But who knows? And that's, again, after a few years of having it, and it's like, oh, okay, this is kind of becoming normal now, and it's lots of fluctuations, and that's what's going to happen. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's just good to remember that for every day that you feel really discombobulated, topsy-turvy, recognize the next day that's like that, that's going to be topsy-turvy for a similar reason. You're actually better prepared to face, and you can maybe lean into the positive and lean away from the negative because you're just becoming more resilient as a human in this changing environment.
Yes. Perfect. Well, what specific issues with invasive species are contributing to more eco-anxiety besides we've talked a little bit about jumping worms already, but are there others?
Yeah, and so invasive species are really interesting in that I think we have a couple of emotions that are all wrapped in there. So I've already sort of alluded to solastalgia and how its impact, like from emerald ash borer killing the ash trees. So that's kind of specific. I also think we as humans feel some more specific responsibility for that. So many of the people that I was working with around jumping worms had likely inadvertently introduced them to the landscape. They didn't mean to. They didn't know. I think they should give themselves grace. But that is probably how it came in a purchase or in a materials movement. So similarly, with many invasive species, it's common that emerald ash borer gets moved in firewood. It's common that many of our invasive plants came out of horticulture, things that were beautifully planted in our yard, maybe beloved, and yet it causes these troubles. And so I think we grapple with that in a different way than some of the other things because it can sometimes feel very personal. And so I think We just need to, again, give ourselves grace, recognize that the information we have is always imperfect. But I love this quote from Maya Angelou, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. And so you don't need to like wallow in the mistakes of the past. Just make sure you learn from them and then move forward in a better way.
Perfect. Yeah, that is a great quote. So what are some steps that people can, with eco-anxiety, they can take to lessen like the effects?
Yeah. So there are actually a bunch of things that we know from peer-reviewed science that can make us more resilient as humans. And so I've alluded to this and I'll say it again. And all of Extension's natural resource programming at this point really aspires to empower hope and agency. So anytime you come to one of our workshops, we want you to leave and know that there's something that you can do that will make the world better. And I hope you leave this podcast with that as well. So remember, in all of your interactions, try to empower that hope and agency. We have the ability to decide how we frame things, decide how we share things, and to whom and when. And so the more we can empower that hope and agency, the better. Because if people are so overwhelmed, and which can happen in this space, then they can't be a part of that valuable solution. I also think it's really important to remember that we are in community. So if my talking about my feelings helps you to express yours, then that is a benefit to the community. And we are creating a more resilient community, which we need to create a more resilient ecosystem and environment. Then there's some like super simple things. Smile. There's a lot of research about how smiles can make someone's day brighter, even if you don't know that other person. So I bike commute to and from work, and I make it policy to smile at everyone I bike by. And I'm moving not super fast, but faster than a walker. And the natural reaction is to smile in response. And I love it. It makes my day a little brighter. I imagine it makes their day a little brighter. It costs me nothing, no time, no energy. Laughing, there's a lot of great research about the power of laughter. And I think it's important to remember infants, they don't have language skills, they haven't developed a sense of humor, yet they can belly laugh with the best of us. Laughter is a rare human emotion that is fully contagious. So at a conference, if we at this table doing the recording were to start to laugh and laugh and laugh hard, we could spread the laughter to the entire room, even if no one else knew what was funny. And it turns out there's all kinds of positive feelings that come from just the act of laughter. So, sometimes if I'm having a really overwhelming day or week or month, we have taken to finding a sitcom that makes us laugh. So we can have 22 minutes at the end of the day where we can sort of let the worries of the day recede and just giggle a little bit with a sitcom. And it can help you sleep better at night, kind of get through those rough patches. That's just one example. There's also like little calendars you can switch over, that kind of thing. When I do presentations now, pretty much without exception, both online and in person, I actually have an eco-anxiety break in which I make everyone stand up and box breathe together. It's a very simple practice where you breathe in. Would you like to do it with me?
Sure, we can do it.
Okay. So I will narrate once and we'll do it together. I encourage everyone listening to the podcast to do it with us. And then you'll do it once on your own. So breathe in for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold for a count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to have you do it on your own one time. So I encourage you to just reflect on how you feel after that very simple, less than 1 minute exercise. There are some others. So I think it is important that we talk about these emotions. So I was really delighted to be invited for this podcast. We can create rituals. I alluded to this with emerald ash borer. So I think emerald ash borer is a really great example. The ash tree is likely to be taken down as a result. So there's many ways in which you can mourn the loss of that. Some people will actually sit outside in the space. Other people will take a piece of the wood and keep it, or incorporate it into a table or use it as a coaster. These things can be rituals that can help you to remember while honoring that. And then, of course, you can create rituals to do the replacement of that tree. I alluded to this before, but reframing, right? So if we always think of it as a deficit or a loss and not an opportunity, that's a missed opportunity to frame it about a more hopeful future. It's not to mitigate the loss, but I think it's important to reframe, often to reframe. I said this before a couple times, but resiliency grows in tough times. So I've alluded to being anxious when the weather is super crazy. But any time, like once you have to take down one tree, it turns out you're better prepared to take down another tree. Once you've planted a tree, you're better prepared to plant another tree. Once you've converted one part of your garden away from grass to pollinators, you're better prepared to do something else, right? So just remember that every time we learn and try, we are growing our skill set, and that's a form of resiliency. So I like to remind people that creating and enjoying art can be really valuable. A lot of people will do art with or in nature or about nature. So there's a really great quiltist who does a lot of work around and changing climate in quilting, right? So a lot of different ways she represents that work, which is just beautiful. And then I'll close with this. Do not forget that being out in nature is good for the mind, body, and soul. Mm-hmm. So whether you're hiking, whether you're pulling garlic mustard, whether you're removing jumping worms, whether you're gardening, whether you're foraging, or whether you're just sitting or laying in a hammock reading a book, it is good for the mind, body, and soul to be in nature. So lean into that when you can. Get your friends and family out there. Decide to hike with your partner, your kids, or your friends, because it is better for everybody.
Yeah, we're actually going for a night hike tonight.
Yay!
So that'll be one of our things that we're taking advantage of the nice kind of weather here, a little bit warmer than usual. So yeah, we'll grab our headlamps and some flashlights and hit the trails for a little bit.
I love that, because often this time of year people get kind of overwhelmed by the darkness,
yes.
right? And if you can lean into the things you can do, the things you can do outside, It's awesome. And my family and I have gone out a couple times to look for the northern lights here recently.
Yes.
And it's been weirdly warm, right? So much more comfortable than some other times. But anything you can do to lean in, because we have so much dark right now that it can feel hard to find that time. But you can still, there's plenty of things to be done outside safely in nature, even when the sun goes down.
Yes. So you talked a little bit about some resources and kind of gave some examples already, but what other resources are available that may help people kind of cope with eco-anxiety and other changes we are seeing in our environment?
Yeah, so I'm going to list a bunch that actually came from that University of Minnesota website. So again, if you Google University of Minnesota eco-anxiety, you should be able to find these so you don't have to take notes while you're driving or biking or whatever you're doing while you're listening to this. So I encourage people to lean into the community aspect of trying to make for a better, more hopeful future. And Extension offers many programs that can do that. So I want to give a shout out to the Minnesota Master Naturalist Program, who those volunteers helped to really initiate this work. But that is a vibrant community of people that really care about the future. We also have programs like the Aquatic Invasive Species Detectors, Woodland Stewards, Master Gardeners, Forest Pest First Detectors. So these are all people that are learning and working and volunteering to make this future better. As I said before, there's a lot of resources on the Extension website, including that handout. There's a handout specific to eco-anxiety, separate from the one about the emotional tolls of jumping worms. Then there are also a whole different sort of area about nurturing resilient people to steward resilient ecosystems. So there's a webinar about that. There's a separate webinar that links to family-friendly earth care. For parents, I think, how a family can approach this as a group. Those are both webinars. Then Extension in Minnesota and in some other states has really leaned into this changing our mental and emotional trajectory. It's called COMET. And that is really how we can be better in our communities, when we see someone that appears to be struggling emotionally, how can we step in, not as a professional, not as like a psychologist, but just as a neighbor that cares? And so that's interesting. It's not specific to eco-anxiety, but there's a lot of healthcare need out there, and this is just one of many. And so if we can be good citizens, I think that can be really helpful. That there's also work through Extension about stress management for farmers. They have lots of things that can cause them stress, some of which are related to eco-anxiety. So I think it's good to remember that. And then I'll just shout out some books. I am a pretty big reader. I'm a huge fan of audiobooks. I think almost all of these, if not all, are available in audiobooks as well. But there's How to Love a Forest by Ethan Tapper. That's really great, super uplifting. Then there's Nature's Best Hope by Doug Tallamy. He is an entomologist out of the Northeast of the United States, and he's written quite a number of books. But if you're not familiar with his work, I'd start with Nature's Best Hope. Then I really enjoyed Accidental Ecosystem, which is a book about essentially the ecosystem and the many critters that live in the built environment with us. Sometimes I think we carry a lot of anxiety about the changes we've wrought in our communities, and those are real. But it turns out that wildlife is quite adaptable too, and maybe we've been underestimating their adaptability. So that book I found really enjoyable. And then a relatively new book that I was very surprised by was The Light Eaters, How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers New Understanding of Life on Earth. And I'll just give you a little hint of what I loved about this book was that they talk about interspecies communication. And I alluded to those really warm days in late winter that were causing me a lot of eco-anxiety. What was I going to do phenologically, my programming? And it turns out that plants actually might be talking, or plants and insects are talking to each other. So there's research that bees can nip the leaf of plants. So they're not eating it, they're just nipping it. And that communicates to the plant that they need to open up their flowers because the bee needs the pollen. And it had never occurred to me that these species were communicating, but it makes some sense, right? If I'm a bee who needs to rely on a plant for my pollen to keep my offspring alive, then maybe I want to talk to them. Conversely, if I'm a plant who needs the bee to do the pollination so I can perpetuate my own offspring, maybe I want to be able to be in communication. But it also made me feel like maybe phenology wasn't as completely topsy-turvy as I had imagined, in that maybe the species are kind of sorting it out amongst themselves, and I'm just an observer of that. So anyway, I thought it was super fascinating. So that's a lot, but I think those are some good places to start.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting a book that I will look forward to reading. We had previously in October, we had a person talking about some of the spiders that are pretty much just home dwellers only. Some of the species that have come over the years, and they just dwell in our houses, and the cellar spiders and things like that. So they do very well in our built ecosystems and help maintain that insect web of life, that we'll say.
No, I think it's a great reminder, right? It turns out that we have been a participant in this ecosystem since, we've been here, right? I mean, Minnesota has had people on the ecosystem since the last glaciers retreated. There's never been a time in Minnesota's modern history that we weren't a part of the ecosystem in one way or another. And so I do think it's really fascinating to really think about it, not from my humanistic ecocentric perspective, but like, what are the other critters doing, and the ones that live in our environment with us. And I every time I go into a bathroom stall and see the spider behind the door, I'm like, well, they're just doing, insect control for me, right? Yep. I don't have to.
Yep. Yeah, he mentioned that too in our last Creepy Crawly podcast. So, yep. Well, perfect. Thanks again, Angie, for shedding some light on these worrisome feelings surrounding changes in our environment and with invasive species, and providing some coping skills. And I hope everyone has some hope and some encouragement in knowing that you're not alone, and that we're all in this together, and there is light at the end there for us. So
thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been really great. And I am grateful every time I'm given the opportunity to talk about this, because so many people tell me how much it means to them. So I'm really glad to be able to sort of open this door for conversation within the community.
Perfect.
Thanks.
This has been Smarty Plants, a podcast from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Our producer is Brittany Ravel, our editor is Larry Schumacher, and I have been your host. You can learn more about pests and other invasive species that affect our environment at www.mda.state.mn.us. And while you head to our website, we'll be working on the next episode of Smarty Plants. See you there.